Good morning, Stephen.
Now, this story, it's the first one I've come across of this kind, but I imagine that this kind of thing could be happening every day.
Yes, it's an extraordinary story. It's the biggest damages claim I've heard about. I have heard of similar accounts before. It's quite common for particularly American companies to sue trademark infringers, and often those infringers are criminals, international criminals often, who are selling counterfeit goods. So it's quite often that those cases are bought. But it's the first one I've heard about involving such large sums of money and involving someone in Australia.
So what's happened here is that somebody pretending to be Sarah Luke is selling dodgy Adidas and NBA gear. So the NBA and Adidas are basically, well, hang on a sec, enough of that, and they've charged this person or this entity in a US court. But because the person's not real, they've come after the real person.
Yes, that's exactly right. It seems like as a result of the Medibank data breach, Sarah Luke's information's been on the dark web and it's been purchased or obtained by some criminal. They've used her PayPal account to do hundreds of illegal transactions selling Adidas and NBA counterfeit goods, so they're certainly a crook. And then the NBA, I think, and the Adidas, I don't think they've done the wrong thing. They've sort of said, okay, this Sarah Luke person is ripping us off, and so they've sued in an American court, and they've actually served her here, but they served her electronically, so they gave her the documents.
Yeah.
And I think she thought, quite understandably, oh, this is just part of another online scam, and just deleted them. And I think that's really at the heart of some of these problems. We're all now much more conscious of when emails come in that they might be fake and we might ignore them or we might delete them or whatever, but that was actually some proper legal documents which she didn't respond to, and then they've got a judgment against her which they could potentially enforce in Australia.
So how do they go about enforcing that in Australia? And I mean, given that it's pretty clear when I say it's pretty clear, it would appear pretty clear that this Sarah Luke is not the person that actually committed the offence. Is it easy enough for her to prove that?
No, so that's the difficult thing. So really the kind of government and legal mechanisms need to catch up with the kind of the reality of cybercrime and trans-border identity theft. They're all really old-fashioned. We've got old-fashioned kind of mechanisms which don't deal well with these things, and old-fashioned institutions, like the Cybercrime Authority can't really deal with the Americans very well. So it's quite difficult for her to deal with this. If she wants to defend it, she can defend it in the US, which obviously would cost a lot of money and be very difficult. But for them to enforce it against her in Australia, they need to register it in the Australian court. So that'd be her best bet to actually to rock up to the Australian court and say, look, I'm not the person who did this, and produce evidence that she was that her identity was stolen as part of a Medibank data breach.
And what would be the likelihood that an Australian court would allow them to list something like this? I mean, wouldn't the clerk in a court here look at it and go, well, hang on a sec, guys, this is a bit ridiculous?
Well, maybe not. It could be that she did do these things. I think the court, all they'd have is a judgment from the Americans.
Yeah.
And it'd look like, she could have done. We don't sort of know for sure. I think the court clerk here would probably register it unless she turned up and gave evidence. And this is the difficult thing, that she's a regular person. She's got kids at home. She's trying to run her life, and suddenly she's got to incur legal fees for this against this international company. And probably if she did defend it, I think she'd be successful. I think she'd be able to prove the situation, but she shouldn't have to do that. That's the trouble. That someone else, like whether it's ASIC or the Cybercrime Authority or the New South Wales Police or the Australian Consumer Complaints Authority, someone should be able to step in and say, this is an Australian citizen, she hasn't done anything wrong, and she shouldn't be the subject of these kind of legal costs.
So I guess the question is, what are the implications of this, both locally and overseas? I mean, what are the likelihood that an Australian court would actually make a judgment against her for the amount of $1.8 million? Now, but then again, I guess the flip side of that is, even if the Australian court says, no, you don't have to pay, she'll never be able to go to the US.
Yes, that's right. So there's two aspects to it. There's the Australian aspect, and it may be that the Americans never enforce it in Australia, and so it goes away effectively for her while she's happily living in Byron Bay and everything's fine. But the reality is there is an American judgment, which would mean if she went to America and tried to, open a bank account, all that sort of stuff, it might affect all of that, or obtain credit in America. And of course, she should be able to holiday wherever she wants and do whatever she wants if she's done nothing wrong. And so unless she's able to sort of get that judgment undone in America, then it could affect all of that. And the reality is the only way to do that would be for her to hire an American lawyer. I think she has actually done that, but she spent about $10,000, and I think 6 months later she still hasn't resolved it. And she just, as a regular person, you shouldn't have to spend a whole bunch of money to defend your name in America when you've done nothing wrong. All you've done really is been ripped off by cyber criminals.
Yeah, so obviously the ultimate wash-up of this is protect yourself as much as you can from these kind of scams. But you mentioned that you've seen other cases like this. What has been the wash-up of those?
Well, it's similar situations where we've had large, both of them, the cases I'm thinking of, are both large American multinationals who have sued individuals, but they've sued individuals who are not Australian, and sued for smaller amounts and got judgment. Both of those, the individuals didn't do anything to defend the case, and that the American companies never enforced in their local jurisdiction. So they just let sleeping dogs lie, I guess, which was sort of okay for them in the end. But the reality is, if they go to those, they go to America and they want to, continue their life over there or whatever, then they've got a big problem.
What liability does Medibank have here?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. So I think the reality is there's a Medibank class action, and she could certainly join that. And I think if you were part of the Medibank class action and able to prove your loss in relation to this, then you'd be eligible for compensation. But it's sort of a difficult one to prove what is your financial loss. Certainly your legal fees, but the stress and worry and upset and all of that, you're not going to get compensated for. So, and especially if she doesn't go to America and she's in Australia, you might say on one view, well, she hasn't suffered any loss, but of course she's suffered a huge amount of aggravation and stress and upset, which in the courts is not you don't get compensation for.
Yeah, it's a frightening situation that any of us could fall into. Alex, always good to talk to you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Stephen.
Alex Martin from Taurus Legal Management.